Okay, as you have heard, we're going to be hearing from Andrew, and he's not just the president of this dynamic university. They have excellent degrees in addiction counseling, by the way. And many of you know Darv Smith, who's our guy in that area. I asked Darv if he'd heard of him. He said, yes, I've heard of him. And they do very good programs, and I'd be happy for any of our students to transfer into that university and complete a degree in addiction counseling treatment. So that was my initial recommendation of Andrew. But he is an educational innovator and networker and understands some of the trends in education. And I'm asking Phil to come up and just describe how they met and started working together. But as Phil comes, let me just define a word that Andrew's going to use with us. It's called unbundling education. Now, for those of you who may have English as a second or third language, that means that until now, most education has been bundled. Like you get a 4-year degree, and if you don't want to do all 4 years, too bad. You got to do the whole 4 years. It's one bundle, and you can't just do part of it. So what he's going to talk to us about is this trend in unbundling education and how it's going to affect us.
I'm not sure I remember how I first came across Andrew, other than an email came past and looked, and we spent some time on Skype. And he talked about taking the online SBS and somehow connecting it to something he was doing. And we talked about that, and in that conversation he spoke about how all of our course leaders would need to have a master's degree. And that was a bit of a problem because my team, I don't think any of them do have a master's degree. But then time went on and we continued to talk, and I want to commend Andrew for his patience and his perseverance in connecting and coming back and talking. And it seemed as time went on, the situation changed, and I was able to go through the accreditation process for the online SBS. He recommended I made some changes, which I groaned at because it meant learning a bit more technology, and despite all I do, I actually don't like that very much. But it wasn't that hard when I actually faced it. But we were then able to go through that process, and I'm very excited that we're in this situation we're in. The online SBS has been accredited through the organization Andrew will talk about. That is just very recent, and we're looking forward to seeing some of their students go through that whole process. So as Andrew says, we have the end-to-end thing happening. So welcome.
All right, it's great to be here, and I've been talking with a lot of people from University of the Nations for quite a while, but you don't really get the feel for the culture until you're actually there. So part of the reason why I was very intentional in pursuing the relationship with YWAM and University of the Nations comes from my own spiritual DNA. So I grew up in the inner city Kansas City. My best friend lived with a drug dealer. My other best friend went to jail for robbing a bank in high school, and I ended up becoming a workaholic and ended up going to grad school at MIT, where I co-founded a research group with one of the fathers of the internet. But then I had a burnout. How many of you have seen the movie Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon? That's basically my life story. So I went there, and I met God. I'd been running from God for a while, and God broke me down, and I said, you know, if you save me, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. And so right after that, I kind of left the whole .com world. I quit a job where I was making $200 an hour to make, let me say, a lot less in the ministry world. And moved into the hood where, you know, there's bullet holes in my house, and have spent the past 20 years living and working among the poor with alternative Christian education. And along the way, I inherited an online college. I had never run an online college, so all of a sudden I had on my title college president, and I didn't even know what I was doing. There's no books written for online or college presidents for dummies, and I had to learn how to do that. So my accreditor actually said, you know, to do this, and after MIT, I was so burnt out and so done with school. I said, God, I will never do that again. I'll never go back to school. And you should never say that to God, because my accreditor said, if you want to run this school, you have to get your doctorate. And I was like, are you serious? I do not want to go back to school. So, but what I did is I decided to marry what I'd been doing for the past 20 years, working among the poor, with what I did at MIT. And I focused on this idea of disruptive innovation in Christian higher education. And that, a lot of what I'm going to be presenting to you has you know, kind of come out of that. But let me talk a little first about the, and by the way, I emailed most of you this presentation. If you don't have it, you can look it up on SlideShare. If you just Google this, or maybe Google or SlideShare search this title, it should come up. But let me tell you, so we, after, you know, the conversation with Phil and actually talking with a lot of other groups, I realized that the U.S. accreditation standards of requiring a master's was a problem. So we actually created a separate accreditation division in a different organization that fell under, and it's a little complicated to explain, but there's a UK accrediting division called Ofqual, and it's a vocational accreditation, and we're working under an awarding body called Qualify. And the partnership, and let me just show you real quick, it's actually on the website, if I can pull this up. So if you go to online SBS, and there should be a drop down, right? Okay, yeah. So you can go to the accreditation partnership, and it'll pull up this page. And the you know, quick summary is that the way it works is people can go through online SBS. If they decide they want to get the UK recognized, after they complete one module through online SBS, they need to register and pay $100, and then they can then get a UK awarding body certificate at the end. So the other thing that it includes is, you know, one of the ways that a lot of, did we just lose our, okay, there we are. The way a lot of the world's working in terms of unbundling is they will, these qualification providers will partner with what's called a top-up degree. So basically what it's like is it's kind of like you get a very affordable, you know, education that, you know, in many cases will cost like $500 for the entire year. And then at the end, you take your last year with a US or UK institution, and then that gets converted into a university degree. So we have 2 degree paths right now where the entire 4-year cost is $5,000, not $5,000 per year, but $5,000 in total. So we will provide a 50% discount to CityVision. So at the undergrad, that's $3,500 per year. At graduate, it's going to be $4,000 per year. So that's anyone connected with YWAM that wants to go through that. And let me just go to the next page. Just so you understand what the basic requirements are. So one, you guys are already doing, and I think it's, you know, God's timing that you're already investing a lot in the centralized transcript information. So, you know, at minimum, you have to have centralized transcript system for all grading. Ideally, for assessments also, that's part of the reason why we went with online SBS to start off, because I know that the quality of assessments may change and how you do assessments may change. So, and then the other thing that we had to do is to map the modules into credit hours, and I think you guys have done that pretty well with University of the Nation. So the other thing, and this is, you know, the main advantage of vocational qualifications in the UK is that instructors only need to either have their bachelor's or have completed the program that they're teaching. So if they're teaching online SBS, then they need to have gone through SBS, or and even if they don't have a UK certificate for that, what you can do, and what Phil did, is he wrote letters saying, you know, this person is, you know, qualified to teach for that. And then the last part is just, you know, paying the $100 for the GC4 certificate. So, and then you get a transcript. This is what it'll look like. It will, you know, qualify as the awarding body, so it'll have their name up there in big, and then the center name. They require that we put the Global Christian College Credit Consortium, which we call GC4 to make it easier, and University of Nations Online SBS, and then you have the certificate details down below. So any questions on that? This is kind of, I wanted to start with the punchline and then go back and explain kind of, you know, a lot of the trends, but I wanted to start with that. Any questions on that so far?
So if I remember correctly, Andrew, it was if someone wants the registered recognized credit, they pay $100 over what they pay normally for the course, but that's good for up to a year of education.
Right, yeah.
So
Exactly.
$100 one time to cover up to a year.
Right. Any other questions that people have? I don't think we actually have the purchasing form available yet on our site, so if you run into problems, let me know. We can get that up. We're busy doing some other things right now. So this is fresh off the, you know.
So just to understand that in the Commonwealth countries they have these certificates and then going on to university. So a certificate for is a vocational training rather than the university training within the Commonwealth.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So in most of the world you have the two tiers. Universities can accept that credit. So part of what this does is it improves the transferability. So since I run City Vision University, our accreditors will only let us accept 30 hours of non-traditional credit, but we can accept up to 90 hours of this type of credit because it's considered accredited. Does that make sense? So, and throughout the world, it will improve the transferability, but the transferability is going to always be determined by the receiving institution. Everyone, you know, understands that. But, you know, within the U.S., for instance, basically how this will translate, there's, you know, three main bodies in the U.S. that kind of collect Christian institutions. There's the CCCU, which is kind of the high end. There's ABHE, and then there's TRACS. CCCU institutions probably in most cases won't accept a whole lot of credit because for them, you know, their tuition's like $30,000 to $50,000 a year. That's going to be lost revenue for them, and they're not going to be excited about losing that much money. The ABHE and TRACS, they usually have more affordable tuition, and they're going to be more accepting, like City Vision is. So does that make sense? So eventually, I hope this will be up to 90 credits that people could get through this. But right now, we're trying to do a pilot, and the way I describe this, we're doing things with accreditation that traditionally aren't done, having multi-year degree paths or multi-country degree paths. And right now, I've run it by the regulators, and they're fine with it right now. But regulators are fickle, and it's kind of like, you know, what Uber's doing, where in some countries Uber's allowed, in some countries it's not. So right now, I mean, that's really how this will run. And within Commonwealth countries, though, I think you're going to get the most traction. So, yeah.
You wouldn't get 90% though, because most in their qualifications framework would say like a certificate 4 you can have 50% of the credits, which is fine. So you would
Right.
So you would typically do like a 2-year diploma, which will give you 1 year of your university degree in the same field of study.
Right. Yeah, it depends on how it transfers. The way we're counting the credits right now is we've mapped this to 1 year, that we could transfer 1 year of credit. So, any other questions on that? Okay. Let me go ahead and jump into the trends. So, there's a big shift that's happening in higher education right now, and I want to talk about, you know, what's generating there's several needs that's driving this. One is that there is a shift going from 100 million students globally in higher education to 263 million students in 2025, and 84% of that growth is happening in the developing world. So, so what that means is you're talking about 137 million new students in developing countries by 2025. This thing keeps wanting to fall over. You think I should put it on the table? Okay. All right. And 4.9 billion middle class globally by 2030. So, you know, there's a huge new market that's going to be there. And, you know, the end result is the demographics. I mean, as you guys are talking, you're saying, you know, how do we serve not just the missionaries, but students from developing countries that may not, you know, be able to afford the same tuition. So, you know, this picture of the world is the one that you guys, you know, basically live by, that, you know, the world's upside down now. It's that, you know, the center of Christianity, this is more where the center of Christianity is now, right? And I know that this is, you know, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys realize that the growth of Christianity is centered around the global south. This red line is how much is happening outside the west of the growth of Christianity. Yeah, this is Todd Johnson, yeah. So, and the west is basically flatlined. So if you actually look at the total growth, by 2025, 99% of the growth is going to be outside the west, and you got 1% within the west. So you have that big shift that's happening. And then the third thing that's happening is you're having this consolidation that's happening. And all over the world, there's massive consolidation that's happening. And the guy who coined this term, disruptive innovation, he said that the next industry to be disrupted is going to be higher education. And I think that these are going to be the groups that are going to disrupt it. So, and it might be, you know, there's been some predictions that said that half of all degrees will be awarded by 4 or 5 different companies in the future, just like, you know, media networks, media conglomerates, that it isn't that hard to imagine the University of Google, you know, versus the University of Microsoft versus the University of Apple and University of Amazon. So that's one possible future. The other is, right now there's 21 state-owned mega universities that have over 1 million students. So you can imagine in most of these universities right now, they're not technologically sophisticated, but once they get technologically sophisticated, they will be able to crush a lot of other, you know, groups out there. Right now, one that is technologically sophisticated is University of South Africa, and they got, I don't think they're at 1 million yet, but they got 650,000 students or something like that, and that drives down your cost dramatically. So the question is, what is the global Christian education platform, and how do we start to think about the world in terms of platform wars? So if you look at Microsoft, just recently did a major overhaul of its strategy, and they kicked out the old CEO, Steve Ballmer, and they brought in someone new because they said, we need to be thinking about platforms. We need to be thinking about, I think their mantra is mobile first and what's the other one? Cloud first. So how do we as Christians think about the whole Christian ecosystem as a platform? So I think that it's likely that there's 3 possible futures for Christian education globally. One is that basically Google eats the world, where you have tech platforms take up 60% of all education. And we just all, you know, it's the, I think it was a Simpsons episode, we all bow before our robot overlords was the, you know, so that's obviously not a preferred future. The other one is that the state mega universities dominate the future. I mean, this is what Hillary Clinton was proposing in the U.S. To essentially nationalize U.S. education. But you know, China and India are the big players where they have multiple, you know, million-person universities. And both of those could significantly decrease Christian higher education. But I think that there's another future where we all collaborate on a platform and we see 400% growth in Christian higher education. So the question is, how do we get that? And, you know, we have these 3 trends. There's the global higher education growth. So more growth in 25 years than happened in the previous 900 years in terms of higher education. Growth of Christianity in the majority world and consolidation. So how do we approach all of these things? And that's a lot of what my second half of my presentation. But any questions or comments before I go into that?
What was the phrase you just said about the higher education growth? What was that?
More growth in 25 years than there was in the previous 900 years. So that it's growing. 167 million new students are being added over from the period of 2000 to 2025, and it took, you know, 900 years to get to the first 100 million. So
Would you see also a trend going from the more liberal idea of education, which is about creating an educated person, towards the more pragmatic vocational
right,
outcome, whether it's higher education or
right,
vocational, that it's a vocational outcome?
right. Yeah, I think that there's going to be a big wake up that right now everything we do is so westernized, and we're forcing everyone else to do westernized accreditation, and it's also focused on, you know, if you're rich, you can afford to think about these things, but if you're not, you got to get the quickest path to a job, you know, so there's the practical emphasis. So I think that that's going to be, yeah, critical. So.
The quote you gave about disrupting higher education, do you have any resource or do you have that name you could just suggest to us?
Yeah, so Clayton Christensen's the guy who coined the term. Yeah, and I actually have an online course, a MOOC, that you can look up in Udemy or iTunes U, and I'll talk about that at the end, where I have a whole free course that's on available online. So, any other questions? Okay. So let me kind of talk about what I mean by disruptive innovation. So, you know, the term disruptive innovation, and let me just pause for a second. It's most often used to describe whenever a new technology comes and kind of wipes out the old technology. So digital cameras. You started off with digital cameras in the 1980s. I bought a digital camera where you could barely tell what was in the picture. Now every smartphone comes with a digital camera that is better than any film camera I ever owned, and it's a lot more useful because I can post to Facebook without scanning in my, you know, pictures and all of that stuff. So so that was an industry that got disrupted. And then you have, you know, smartphones themselves disrupted computers, which disrupted mini computers, which disrupted mainframes. So you have these waves of disruption. And the same thing's happening in higher education, where you had traditional higher education, and that model I would summarize as a few million students for $10,000 a student. And then you, basically the idea of what happens in disruption is you increase often 10 times as many users, and you drop your cost by a tenth of the cost. So I think that the next trend is going to be radically affordable blended education. Some of that's going to be online only, but I think blended is going to be what dominates in the developing world. And you're going to have 10 million students at $1,000 per student. So this is how Christian higher education could grow. So right now, Christian higher education is stuck at a few million students, and I'm kind of the guy that often gets called in to these Christian universities in the US that says, how do we change? And what they're all focused on is, how do we not shrink by 20%? Because all projections are we're going to shrink by 20%. And what I keep telling them is, you're asking the wrong question. If you focus on the developing world, you can think about how do you increase by tenfold. And they say, well, we can't afford to do it that way. And I say, well, that's why I'm here talking to YWAM, because you guys can afford to do it that way. So. Right. So, you know, how do you reach 10 million students at $1,000 a student? And then I think the next wave is 100 million students at $50 a student. So radically affordable mobile education. And you might think about 100 million students at $50 a student. That's impossible. How do you do that? Well, I'm already talking with one of our partners that we got accredited is doing that. So all of you are probably familiar with YouVersion Bible app. It's been downloaded by over 200 million people. And there's a group out there called Third Millennium Ministry. They have a mobile app, and they have online courses. What they did is they got donors to invest $34 million to enable them to buy and build an online seminary with some of the best instructors in the world, and the entire thing's for free. And their goal is to reach 100 million people. And we just accredited that. So people going through University of the Nations potentially could use this as one of the components that they add. You know, they do online SBS, and then they do this. And it's actually pretty complementary, because more of their stuff is theologically focused, and rather than just getting at the core of the Bible and things along those lines. So, you know, that's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to reach 100 million people for $50 per person. So the basic idea behind disruptive innovation, whenever you, like if you Google disruptive innovation, you look at Wikipedia, this will be the chart that shows up. I've added a couple lines to it. But what happens is you have, so let's use the digital camera example. So the first digital cameras were horrible. They're even worse than the disposable cameras. So what this is performance, how good the quality of a camera is. This is over time. So the disposable cameras didn't get that much better, right? So it didn't take that long over time before the most basic digital cameras were better than disposable cameras, right? And then you get to the mid-tier, and it's only been in the past 5 or 10 years that the digital cameras have gotten as good as the best film cameras. But I just talked with a friend of mine who's a high-end photographer. I said, do you use film cameras? And she just laughed, like, no. Which if I asked her that 10 years ago and I said, do you use digital, she would have said no. So So what happens is certain technologies go up this curve. And one of the things that's common with those technologies is they're unbundled. And I'll talk a little bit more what I mean by that. But the idea is this digital camera is you can just buy this camera component and you can throw it onto an iPhone, and this camera component costs like $10 or $20. And now it's better than all the film cameras that you got before. So the camera component's unbundled versus interdependent architecture where every component has to be designed with every other component. So that's the way universities are built right now. You have to get the 4 years or you get nothing, basically, is the way it works. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. So another way of demonstrating that, my kids love toys. You got the Tonka truck. You can't really take apart the Tonka truck without breaking it. My kids try. So, but I have one son who's obsessed with Legos. So the idea is if you can get interoperable standards, then what you do is you get unbundled education, which is going to be Lego blocks. And then out of those Lego blocks, you can build a truck. And out of that, you can build things like Lego cities. And I now almost have a Lego city in my house with all my son's Lego toys. And that's what a university is. But the idea is you create some basic standards that then allow different groups to use different things. So that's part of what's meant by unbundling. So let me use another example. So in this example, the idea is, the term that's used is a vertically integrated university. So you get all these different components, and if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, there's 3 categories in Bloom's taxonomy. There's the cognitive, the head. There's the psychomotor, the hand. There's the affective, which is the heart, right? And I've called these content and knowledge. And in this tier, and I'll explain a little why I said lower level cognitive. So this is lower level Bloom's cognitive, metacognition and skills. So I'm both bundling stuff that's going to be psychomotor, you need hands, and high level cognitive. And the reason why I'm doing that is because this tier is getting automated right now. Machines can do this well. You can get this online through a MOOC. This tier, you need people. The transformative experience, whenever we were talking this morning, I thought about what are the strengths of YWAM and University of the Nation. I mean, you guys are passionate people. You give up it all and you go into crazy places, and then you get hurt and you go do it again. So, right? So. Right. So, but you also, these are core values to you guys, and what you're saying is the West has been imbalanced, and the West has focused 95% on this, right? So, and that's part of why I'm here, is because I believe that these things should be in balance, and then the last part is the access to opportunity. So the branding, the licensing, and quality assurance. So right now, you can't just say, I want the cognitive from the university. You can't just say, please just give me your diploma. They wouldn't do that, right? So you have to get all those together. But what's happening is each of these layers is being broken up into being horizontally integrated. So what that means is it used to be to get a computer, each of the components of the computer were all made by IBM. And then now all the components of the computer are made by different players, and you buy the best in breed. So you can get university courses, and you can get those online, but they're competing with, there's these companies called Christian courseware companies. They're competing with open education. So Khan Academy, if you're familiar with them, or Sailor Academy, MOOCs and apps, so massively open online courses. These are courses that often will have 100,000 or 1 million people taking them. Harvard, MIT, Stanford, all the best universities in the world have put their material online for free. And then what they do is they charge for their certificate to validate it. Then you have books and paid courseware vendors out there. And then you have groups that are called alternative education providers, where if you just need a math course, you can get a math course that you can transfer for college credit for $99. So what's happened is, we've always had books like this where, we will bring in a third-party book into our courses. But now there's a lot more components that you can integrate to your courses. So whenever I designed my entrepreneurship course, a third of the course I used a MOOC. And I, today people will bring in a lot of YouTube videos and things along those lines. But more and more, it becomes easy to outsource. Instead of just saying, I'm going to bring in a book, I'm going to bring in an actual course. And some universities that I know, even high-end Christian universities, they're taking the entire degree program that they're putting their name on it, and it's all someone else's material. And they're charging 10 times. So then the next tier that you have, now part of what's happening on this tier is faculty. It used to be a faculty had to be a jack of all trades, had to be good with people, had to have high-level degrees, had to be good at grading, be able to think about a comprehensive Christian worldview. But the problem is, to get those people, it's freaking expensive. And what's happened, and this is the reason why you guys don't limit it to only faculty that have masters, is or doctorates, is because it's easier to unbundle that. So what's happening is, part of the faculty, I have a friend, he's actually was a YWAM guy in Boston, and he's taking classes at Harvard, and he was taking a math class, and he said, it's funny, I'm taking a math class in Harvard and I skip all the lectures because it's easier to learn the material on Khan Academy because I can replay the video and it's broken up into components, but then I go to Harvard to get the test. So he's already unbundling his education, right? And that faculty member doesn't realize that he's not as good as lecturing as the guy on Khan Academy, right? And he's been replaced. So then the other thing, and this is what's important, is it's easy to unbundle the credentialed online faculty, because you're going to have places where you can't get someone credentialed, but you can get someone online and all they do is the grading, and then that's going to satisfy the accreditors. And then you have the Christian worldview program designers. Those usually are often the most expensive. These are going to be the people who design your degrees. And then at this level, you also, this is at the core of what you do, DTS. You have internships, missions trips. So this is at the core of what you guys do. And then the next tier, so the transformative experience. So that is your bread and butter of what, if I had to summarize, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but you transform lives. I mean, that's what you guys do. And I honestly think you're better at doing it than Christian universities are. And I think, that's why I'm here, because I think you're better at transforming lives than Christian universities are, and it's easier to go to someone who already knows how to do that and then partner in an unbundled way. So so you guys have your courses, you have your campuses, and then you can have uncredentialed local coaches. So the way we're operating, we have a partnership in Kenya right now, and all the instruction happens online. What the local coach does is they will help answer questions, more like a tutor, and they will make sure if there's a computer lab there, and they'll help people if they have problems with the computer. But they don't need to have a master's or a doctorate degree to do that. They just need to be someone who's more basic. So by unbundling the 4 components of faculty into those 4 areas, there's ways that you can creatively meet the needs of accreditors. And then the last component is access to opportunity. So you have this thing called top-up degrees, and then you combine that with vocational qualifications. So you do 3 years cheap under vocational qualifications, then you find a top-up degree. There's a huge market for this. So whenever I said that there's 167 million new students that are coming online, my guess is over 100 million of those are going to go through these vocational systems because they're affordable, they're under $500 a year in most of the world. But if they want jobs, then it can be very helpful to get a university degree. That is a big distinction. So then you can get industry certifications, ordinations, and then there's other unbundled Christian programs. So any questions on that? I know that that's a very dense slide, but this helps explain. Whenever I say Lego blocks, these are the Lego blocks. And what you can do is you can assemble whatever Lego creature you want out of these Lego blocks, and you can say, I want to combine some third millennium Christian courseware with credentialed online faculty and uncredentialed local coach, and combine that with online SBS, and all of a sudden you have a 2-year program that might be government recognized. Does that make sense? So any questions on that? All right. Okay, so the first part was why now? Why is it possible now for for you guys to have, not just Australia being accredited, but I think that there's an opportunity for a lot more of University of the Nations to get accredited. So one part is just this unbundling is happening. And I realize you guys have been unbundled for a long time, and you've thought like this for a long time, and you probably feel unbundled, right? So I see some of you laughing saying, yes, I'm unbundled, and right. But so what's happening is the rest of the world's catching up to what you guys have been doing, and you guys, there hasn't been a category for accreditors to think about you, because you guys, there's no universities out there that are in 100 countries and in this many languages, and there's no accreditors. The UN doesn't issue accreditation, right? But they're, what did you say? You're scared of that? Right, yeah, exactly. That's probably a good thing. Right, so, but what's happening is there's all these other groups like these MOOCs. MOOCs actually are a lot like you. They're in many languages. They're serving hundreds of millions of people. And now accreditors are being asked, what are you going to do with them? And they're coming up with standards for how to evaluate them. And those standards actually are going to have the same application to you all. Does that make sense? All right. So the second reason why now is just technology is enabling central record keeping that's needed to document alternative education. So, until now, you guys didn't have a central system, right? I mean, when did you implement it? Just the past few years?
Well, we've had a central system that didn't work very well.
Right. So now you get one that's, it used to be, not as accurate. Now it's a lot more accurate, right? So this has happened in field across field. Who's ever heard of this? Heard of Hernando de Soto and the idea of dead capital? Okay, so a couple community development people. The idea, he wrote a book, and the point of the book was, if you could just document all the stuff that poor people already own, then that would be worth more than all the aid that you're giving them, because right now they can't access loans, they can't access financial systems, and they have houses that if the local drug lord decides to take over the house, they take it over. And they can't go to the government and say, I owned it, because there's no property rights, right? So he said that the value of that's $9.3 trillion, which is a number that's hard for me to even imagine, right? And the reason why that's happening is because there's now systems where you can actually track that, where it used to all be done by pen and paper or typewriter, and the developing countries didn't have the ability. India is going through the same thing. So it used to be there's 400 million people in India that had no form of identification, and that ended up resulting in, whenever the government gave payments to the poor, sometimes as little as 10% got through after you had 8 layers of bribery. So now you can the government can skip the middleman and just give the payment directly to the poor. And I would say there's a third area, which is undocumented alternative education. And I think that's also trillions of dollars of lost value. And that I would put you all, like what you're doing, in that category. So there's a question that I like to ask. It's kind of a baited question. So is education more secular or Christian globally? And people look at this chart here, and if you look at higher education globally, only about 5% is Christian. So you kind of feel like, oh, we're surrounded on all sides, and you start to get this, remnant, mentality that, Jesus is going to come back, and there's only going to be 2 Christians that are holding the fort down, right? So, which, that I think is the wrong mindset. This is a better mindset, is that if you look at church attenders and you look at the entire body of Christ as an educational institution, then we're 91% of the secondary education. Now, this is oversimplification because I'm not including other religious institutions, but the point is, we're the largest educational institution in the world right now. So we shouldn't be having this mentality that we're dying. So but the reason why we have that mentality is we're essentially saying the only thing that matters is the tip of the iceberg. So this accredited education, so you got Bible colleges, Christian universities, seminaries, Christian liberal arts colleges, and we're saying that that's what's above that we can see, but then there's a lot of stuff that's under that. So, and there's this big category called non-traditional but accreditable education. So Bible institutes, ministry experience, educational discipleship programs, alternative education, professional experience. And then there's another category that probably is never going to be accredited. You know, I would like to just write down somewhere that I've listened to 8,000 sermons and then get a degree because, you know, I've listened to that many sermons, but I don't think that would necessarily be a good idea, right? Or, you know, I've listened to so many hours of Christian radio or, you know, things. So there's some stuff that you're just not going to be able to get accredited. But there's this stuff in the middle. That's what's interesting. So if you look at the Christian education ecosystem and, you know, using the term tertiary education rather than higher education to make it more inclusive. So you have the accredited higher education. So you got Bible colleges, Christian universities, online seminaries, these church and ministry micro campuses that are starting to happen. And then underground, you have, so missions and training, you know, organizations. So what YWAM's doing. But then you have, you know, tens of thousands of Bible institutes that are out there. You have homeschool networks. You have Christian continuing education, Christian free and open source. You have commercial Christian courseware. You have unaccredited ordination training. And what this is, you know, I spent a ton of time collecting all these different groups. So you can download this if you want to actually link to some of these organizations, because this is the ecosystem. So whenever I say, how are we going to compete with Google? How are we going to compete with million-person universities? Well, part of how we're going to compete is it's going to be this whole group working together collaboratively and not just saying we each have our own fiefdoms. And in some cases, we're also going to work with secular providers. You know, if you need to learn math, why not use Khan Academy, right? And you can add Christian elements onto that, but, you know, use Khan Academy. So we partnered with Sailor Academy. One of our GC4 partners is Sailor Academy. Sailor is a wealthy businessman. He invested $50 million in developing a 4-year degree path for business and a 4-year degree path for computer science. So we are using 3 of their years as a part of our business degree path. And there's other things that we can do like that. So the summary, and, you know, this picture here is a picture of, you know, kind of the old, not necessarily good missions model where, you know, we're achieving good, and this is in the U.S., where you took Native Americans and you dress them up in suits and you say mission accomplished, right? And that's not necessarily, you know, we've westernized them, right? And yeah, they don't look happy, do they? Right. So they're like, why did you do this? And to a certain extent, I think that's what we're doing in Western accreditation, is we're forcing people to wear the suits of Western accreditation. And you all have said, screw that, we're not even going to deal with that. But I think that the world's starting to wrestle with this problem. And vocational accreditation actually has been a fairly good solution to this. And I think that's, you know, the term between higher education, which I would say almost is exclusively used in westernized terms, and tertiary education and vocational education, which I think a lot of times is much more locally contextualized in terms of how it's interpreted. Does that make sense? Is it tertiary? Yeah. Okay. Right. Right, yeah, and within tertiary, they'll say higher is one category of that, right, yeah. And vocational is the other, right, yeah, exactly. So was there a comment or question on that? Okay. So I'm going to try to map out some of the components of the ecosystem again. So you have bundled education, which is kind of the left, vertically integrated, and then you have the bottom, so you have these other components. So this is courseware. This is where I've mapped out all the Christian courseware that's out there. There's also some secular courseware that's out there, but I've suggested you guys might think about how can you build, you know, if you're trying to build a Lego city, you can start with all your own Lego bricks, but you could also use some of these other Lego bricks. You know, Third Millennium has $34 million invested. Why not use some of their courses? And then there's others that are out there. Our Daily Bread, are you guys familiar with those folks? So our Daily Bread has an online university that they've probably put tens of millions of dollars into their stuff. So there's a lot of other things that are out there. You know, I was going to suggest to Phil, if you guys are looking at Greek and Hebrew, you might look at Bible Mesh. So they have really good Greek and Hebrew courseware that you can get that will make your life easier. It does cost, but sometimes it can be worth it if it dramatically improves the quality of what you're doing. Does that make sense? Then on top of that, you have alternative credit mechanisms. So GC4 is one. There's another one called ICHE, and I know that YWAM has been responsible for developing globalaccreditation.com. In the US, we have something called ACE credit, vocational qualifications, standardized tests, prior learning assessment, articulation agreements. There's a lot of theological education that falls under ISET. And in many countries, that's non-governmental because they don't license theological institutes. And then the others, I use this term microcampuses. I mean, it's the same thing as what you guys have. Is you call them training centers, or you just call them campuses? We have a number of names for them. Okay, so whatever people want to call them, right? Okay, but I think the rest of the world is starting to, come up with these things. I mean, within traditional education, often they would call them study centers for correspondence education. But now there's a lot of groups that are starting to use these MOOCs, and they're creating up these micro campuses, using that. So, and the idea behind that is you started with these big major universities, then you went to, in the US you have community colleges, and then, now you have a much smaller, you might only have 10 students or 5 students there. And part of what that happens is if more of your education is online, it becomes easier to, what does it take to create a center? And then what you can do is add on accredited degree pathways like through City Vision. So I don't need to go into that. So here are some potential pathways that you guys can have. So this is just, generic pathway someone could take through University of the Nations. I'm just using this kind of as an example. So they could start with DTS and then take some stuff online SBS, and then they could go on campus to do the last 2 years. There's no need to work with a partner like GC4, but I'm using this as an example to talk about other paths. So this is whenever I talk about rebundling Legos, this is some ways that you might, here's my Lego creations, looking at the unbundled. So you could take DTS that might be validated by YWAM Australia. So I've been talking with some of the folks that are connected with YWAM Australia, trying to understand could they validate YWAM, could they validate DTS? Now what that does is it gives a government recognized transcript that becomes more internationally portable. I might be able to do that through the UK, but right now I am not ready to do that because I need to make sure that the basic stuff works first. So then you could do a year online SBS. And then you could do, a year through YWAM Australia qualification where it gets validated through Australia. It could happen anywhere in YWAM, but if Australia would validate it, then it becomes much more accessible or transferable. Or you could do something, their junior year through City Vision, or we have other GC4 partners that they could do. I mentioned they could go through, right now, if someone uses, if they use Third Millennium, it only costs $200 for a year of college. And that's available through their computer or through mobile. And then they do the last year through us, and we got degrees in ministry, degrees in business, addiction studies are the biggest, missions, and nonprofit management. Or they could work with other universities. But the idea is if you assemble these components in this way, then it becomes much more transferable. Do people understand? Let me pause on this one because I think this one could have some of the most implications. Do you guys have questions? Or I feel like I'm talking too much. I want to get a little more feedback from people. So.
Are you going to give us a slide or at all an idea on pathways to master's or even doctoral levels? Are you working into those areas?
Yeah, I wanted to start, as I mentioned, this is like Uber, where the regulators could come after you at any point. So I want to get the best case that we can, and then later go after the more challenging cases. So right now for us, our accreditor lets us transfer 75% of undergraduate. We could do 50% of graduate. So we currently have a master's in social entrepreneurship, and we're going to be adding a master's in business administration. And in that, we'll have 5 specialties, nonprofit management, let me think, education management, some other ones. We're just getting ready to launch that. So if someone took that path and they did the first half or the first even full year through you, then they could transfer that to us. And the last half with after discount would only cost $2,400. And you get a master's degree for $2,400. So US accredited. Not yet. We're going to do probably a doctorate in business administration will be our first. But there's other schools. So I got my doctorate through Bakke University, and I potentially could try to work out a partnership with them on some of these paths, because they have their transformational leadership degree and they have a DMin also. I think, I'm entrepreneurial risk taker, so I think a lot of people are saying, why don't you try that first? And, we'll let you be the pioneer, and if you get shot, then let us know. So yeah, does that make sense? Okay, any other questions on that? And part of what I'm also thinking about on this is, and I don't have this slide up here, but I have been wanting to talk about ways that we might send our students to YWAM, and we would unbundle coming from our side too, and say, you know what, we're not as good at the transformational part because we're online school, and you can do some transformation online, but it's a lot better to put them in there with people. And so send them to your way, and then together the idea is, I think YWAM plus City Vision could be potentially more competitive than a lot of the more costly Christian institutions out there. And that's ultimately what I'd be banking on for that, and say, you know what, I'm going to lose some money for that year, but in the end, I'm going to get a lot more students because we have a more competitive, solution. So.
I don't know how many people would know City Vision. Could you just give us a few sentences on City Vision?
Yeah, let me jump to, I have a slide on that. So City Vision, so the history, it grew out of the Association of Gospel Rescue Missions. So it actually was rooted in missions. So in the U.S., we have rescue missions, kind of like Salvation Army. They'll work with the homeless, and it was originally called Rescue College. It was founded in 1998, and then got accredited in 2005. We're accredited through the Distance Education Accrediting Commission. Whenever we got accredited, none of the Christian accreditors would accredit online institutions, so that's why we went through them. So let's see, what else? The degrees that we have, you can see them kind of in that fourth bullet point: missions, addiction studies, nonprofit management, business, associates and masters. And I didn't add in yet we just added a Christian leadership, ministry and leadership, and then we have a master's in social entrepreneurship. So we, values-wise, our core values, so we're evangelical. We are, we're non-denominational, so we work with people, from all backgrounds. My personal, core is evangelical charismatic, as I mentioned. And so part of my testimony, whenever I came back to God, I came back through Mike Bickle's ministry, the founder of IHOP, and then was in the Vineyard for about 10 years, then now go to Assemblies of God. So, and, we have standards on, we use the National Association of Evangelical Statement of Faith with all our faculty and things like that. So, yeah.
I have a question. Could you share with us a bit how you see the accreditation on a global scale? So this is grounded very much in the US accreditation kind of bodies. How do you see it for China and India and all? How do you see this all unfold?
Right. Well, I think most of the world follows the two-tiered system where you have the vocational and then you have the university level. And I think that your opportunity is, the vocational is infinitely more flexible. But what you need to do is start there like you've done in Australia, but figure out ways to convert that into university credit. So almost every country in the world has some sort of vocational track. Now, some of those countries are going to define that in a way that they will not view ministry as a valid vocation, which is kind of annoying. But a lot of countries will, and in those countries, I think that's going to be the big path. And I would say that that's probably the starting point. Now, there's other things that are coming out that are, how do you give academic credit to things like MOOCs and things along those lines, and that might present opportunities for you all, but the dust hasn't settled on how those standards are going to be. But I would say that that's, I think the way I've been describing it to people is, you got to use the world systems for kingdom good. So there's these corporate companies that they'll find ways that they'll get the profits. They'll, you know, Apple will sell its products in the U.S. and then it'll book its profits in Ireland, right? And then they avoid paying taxes, right? Now, and they're doing that legally. Now, granted, there's some ethical issues with that, but there's ways that you can do the same type of things in accreditation where, you know, you go to the country that has the most flexible accreditation system. So right now, the reason why we decided to create this in the UK is UK has the widest recognized, you know, accreditation that also has standard, that has a vocational system. Australia, and you know, part of my recommendations later is that since you already have Australia, then that could be a hub. So how do you kind of engineer your whole system so that you're able to grant credit? You know, something might happen in Zimbabwe, and then Australia issues the credit, and then they do their top-up year in in an online U.S. institution. That person's never left Zimbabwe, but they just got credit from Australia and the U.S., and they have a U.S. accredited degree. Does that get to your question? Okay. So, any other questions before I move on? Let me just show a couple other paths, and so you could also use this to go to a U.S. associate's degree. I know the associates doesn't really carry a lot of weight in a lot of the rest of the world, but for those of you who are in the U.S., then you could use the online SBS to do an associate's. Another path you could do, so in Australia, and I guess I have a question for you. How often do you see someone who will do like and I guess you have different levels, who will do one of your lower levels, and then use those levels somewhere else, transfer to another school and use those levels? Does that happen very often? Yeah, outside YWAM, that'll happen also. Okay, yeah. So that's basically what this path is saying. It's saying that if you get a UK validated diploma, then you know it's going to be a little more complicated than doing it within the same country. But most other countries will say, okay, UK has to have at least as good a standard as us, so they're more accepting of those. And I don't know, like in Australia, have you guys taken UK qualifications before and transferred them in?
Most Commonwealth countries, 56 Commonwealth countries,
Right. Yep.
most of them have an integrated, what they call qualifications framework.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which goes from certificate 1 right through to a PhD.
Right.
Is integrated and talks about how it can all fit together and how what credits you can accept where, and it's quite a complete. I mean, some are more that way than others, but most of those Commonwealth countries will have something similar to what we
Right.
have.
Yeah.
And they have because of that, they have an acceptance across that.
Right.
You know, so Canada has something.
Yeah, so getting back to your question, you're asking specifically what we would need to do to get the transfer into master's and doctorate within the UK system. Level 7 corresponds to master's, and level 8 corresponds to doctorate. So we would need to get your level 7 and level 8 validated. Now in Australia, are you just through the bachelor's, or do you do master's?
We just vocational, and because we're looking at, Shirley's looking at going to the upper levels, beginning to look at that from Perth. The reason for that is the requirements once you get beyond to bachelor's level. One of the key requirements is that your lecturers have a degree equal to or above, and a certain high percentage of your lecturers. That means in every DDS we would be looking for their academic qualification rather than their anything else, and so that was a hindrance to us when we started 25 years ago.
Right.
Now, with the changes in terms of online, and there's perhaps, and that's what Shirley's experienced, there's some flexibility in these things. Things have changed in the 20 years we've been doing this, so there's now, we're investigating whether, looking at how can we manage through that, and is there a way that we can get recognised as a university within the Australian system?
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, just to emphasize one of the key points on the vocational system is that most of the university systems, you have to have a degree level above what you're teaching. So master's to teach at bachelor's level, doctorate to teach at master's or doctorate level, which is just brutal. It's not how Jesus did it. I mean, Jesus did it, and he said to the disciples, okay, now you go do it, and then go teach people to do it, right? He didn't say, and go study for 10 years, and then, you go do it, right? So, and I think the vocational system's closer to that. It says you got to at least be trained in this thing. So if you get I guess in Australia it's a level 9. If you get a level 9, can you teach the level 9, or do you actually have to have a university?
They don't look as so once you get to university,
Okay.
it's a totally different system. I mean, in terms of some of those.
Okay. Okay. In the UK, you can teach level 7 having a level 7. You don't have to have a master's.
Yeah, that would be the same.
Okay. Got you. All right. All right. So let me just keep going. So the other thing in terms of the Lego concept is someone could come through and they could take online SBS, but then any of our other partners in GC4, those are basically Legos that meet the Lego standard. So they could, you could use Third Millennium. We have other groups, Sailor Academy for Business, Trinity Global Academy, Vision International. So you could build kind of, people in University of the Nations could build their own degrees using other GC4 partners. Does that make sense? So that's how you would get to a $5,000 four-year degree path. Now, you're gonna need someone to help them go through it, because some of these things, like Sailor Academy, it's self-study. So it's hard for someone to go through an entire year self-study without having some, support. So this last slide is basically, my job after MIT before, going and working among the poor was to be kind of a strategic analyst. So if I put on that hat and I say, what would I do if someone said, come up with a strategy, this would be my recommendation. So one is right now we're trying to do a pilot with SBS Online, but what we could do is we could expand accreditation to other University of the Nation programs that have the strongest assessment and documentation paper trails. Now, the reason why we can't do that otherwise is because if the assessments aren't standardized enough, then that becomes a challenge, because you have to be able to say that, okay, someone passing this can do, is it the same level, and that may or may not happen depending on, where it is in terms of what the standards are. And let me know if you guys have questions as we go through this. I'll pause at the end. I've been talking with folks from YWAM Australia on how to validate transcripts of other University of the Nations credits to improve transferability. I would recommend anywhere where you're in countries that have significant capacity and they have vocational qualifications. Most countries, it's not too difficult to get. That tier is probably, I don't know, only 20% of the work to get the university tier of accreditation, at least in my assessment. And then, so that would be the first part. Why don't I pause on that? As I'm getting recommendations, there could be a lot more pushback, and I realize I'm still learning about what you guys, what your values are, so I don't want to have anything that, conflicts with that. But how do those type of steps sound to folks? Or questions on that?
I'm not even sure how to ask this or whether it's appropriate, so I'm sort of fumbling a little bit with it. That in terms of, say, while I'm Australia being the validating and transcripting, if you want, authority, does that, in a sense, put the U of N under the authority of one nation, of one.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I understand that's a hugely sensitive thing, and that's why you guys have avoided accreditation. As I see it, let's fast forward 10 years from now, and if you guys get a good strategy around this, I think you might have accreditation in 10 or 15 different countries under vocational systems and 1 or 2 countries under university systems. And then does that question still make sense? What it really means is which label do you want to put on things? And at the end of the time, I think that it really depends on how you guys are organized, and you aren't organized that way. So Australia can't veto. It just would say, like whenever I talked with Phil, the one change I suggested he did, and I didn't say required it, was people were emailing their assignments to the faculty, and I said, why not just use Moodle? That would probably make it easier for everyone. And I think in the end, it's actually going to save you work, and everyone will be glad that you're doing it that way. But that's a fairly minor modification. So there might be suggestions like that just make it, because it makes it easier to find the paper trail rather than searching 100 different email addresses and saying, can you send me this, because some accreditor somewhere wants to look at it, then you just have it in one location. Does that make sense?
Can I follow that question up?
Yeah.
So do you see, moving into the future, do you see that we could be moving away from the nation state? So example of this, in Asia, we're looking at, all of Asia, the ATA is probably one of the most flexible,
Right.
and it seems to be growing, the
Yeah.
Asian Theological Association.
Yeah.
We're looking at courses even in India and South Asia, linking up to ATA. And there's people on ATA that are very favorable to YWAM and the U of M. So do you see that we could move toward a multi-nation kind of, or regional based
Right.
accrediting?
Yeah, so that's already happening. So whenever I looked at, this tier here, the alternative credit, the non-governmental theological association. So ISET is over, not really over, but they're organizing their association where ATA is. And really it's a question of how do you want to use it. So ATA is going to assist in recognition within Christian institutions, but probably not as much in other contexts. So, and I think that, part of it is the Christian institution thing shouldn't be a problem if we would just all get along. You should be able to transfer credit. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think in Asia is a good example that ATA may have as much traction, especially in ministry circles, as a governmental, or maybe more. In some cases, the strategy is going to be to work with vocational. In other cases, it will be to work with ATA or some sort of theological based. And it might vary for your degrees, and it might vary for what paths people are taking. But part of my passion also is for people who are bivocational. I think increasingly as you get people who are not just Western missionaries, but are people who are coming from developing countries, there's the trend towards bivocational pastors and giving them credentials that operate in both domains, that they need the ministry credentials, but they need credentials that will get them a better paycheck. I think that the governmental helps with the better paycheck sometimes. So.
You'd be saying, Andrew, that like into the future, like say in Asia or all over the world, we should be looking at multiple link ups.
Right.
ATA kind of things, and then also the government kind of things.
Right.
Really
Yeah.
all of the above, really, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of it is, you guys are probably the best example of a multinational corporation, Christian multinational corporation. You're in so many countries, so many languages, right? What do multinational corporations do? What you need is some people who've, been strategists for these multinational corporations to be advising you on how do you use these legal systems to your advantage, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do is to say, okay, this country makes it hard to do it this way, so therefore I'm going to, in Africa, like Ethiopia won't recognize anything theological. So you're going to have to go with the African Theological Association? I can't remember. You're going to have to go with that, or there's other options where you could actually go with a U.S.-based accreditation and use tracks or something like that. So I think that having different flavors and thinking through, you have to do it in a way that all of a sudden you don't have 17 different regulations you have to follow, 17 different masters, right? Because then that's going to kill you. But I think that there's ways that you're already doing that with Australia. So.
I think just to roll back a bit our story, with the UFN globally, we thought for a while, or for a long while, that this global framework with somehow of a global accreditation will somehow work. And I think we are realizing and getting much more aware that this is more complex than what we thought, and that the nations are moving in a direction not really towards us in this regard, but more away from us. And that in many ways we will need to become very flexible, and we will need to put our roots down in a number of places and nations to actually make it work. And all of this is also linked to a question of immigration and visas. So some nations, they will say, if this is not accredited in our land, we are not granting you a visa. You can be accredited across the world in Australia, great, but if it is not in our land, you will not get any student visas. So the complexity for all those who run campuses around the world is increasing massively. And so we will need to prayerfully consider and find wisdom from people like Andrew and see how this is all working out for us and how we can actually move forward in the growth and in the implementation of the vision that God has given us. And so this is a season of much pondering how our clustering in certain parts of the world, in other parts of the world, that there is a new shape that this UFN will take on when it comes to accreditation and its legal integrations into different parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, it's likely that aspects of accreditation are going to get harder, and then aspects will get easier. And what does a multinational corporation do? That they go to the place that's easy, and they do what they need to do there. And then the place that's hard, they just, if all of a sudden labor conditions are, not as attractive, then they, so that'll be a part of how you weather these things. Of, like, is Trump going to shut down all your visas in the U.S., or is there going to, well, that's going to be painful for the centers, but if there's ways that you can, reallocate resources, you can adjust to that. So I think that, the companies essentially, they run circles around the regulators. And ultimately, instead of them, beating us down, we need to figure out how do we run circles around them by using the global system. And part of what I found out is, so there's global trade agreements that actually regulate what countries can do. And part of the advantage of that is countries, for the most part, they can't have a blanket statement that we're not going to accept degrees from somewhere, because that's actually in the trade agreements. So it's a part of, I think it's GATT, and there's certain signatories. So ultimately, you can't require institutions accept it, but that's actually considered a trade barrier that some of the WTO agreements, if they block all degree transfers. So that's part of the reason why you're able to transfer some of this credit between countries. So, okay, let me go into the second point, the modular partnership strategy. So I mentioned there's this term top-up degrees, so with schools like City Vision. So we can help convert something that's vocational into a higher value. There's, a UK, there's UK options for that. I don't know of any Christian ones right now. Part of what I've been saying is I think in the long term, I'm going to develop paths where I'm going to try to compete with CCCU schools, and that path will probably, University of the Nations would be a key part of that, because I can't provide the campus experience. I'm an online school. But if there's actually a school out there called Minerva, and they are trying to be the Ivy League. Basically, if you invented an Ivy League school today, how would you do it? And the way they've designed the program is you're in, I think, 3 countries every year. So by the time you're done, it might be 4 countries. I think you've been in 16 different countries. And they're having people turn down Harvard to go to the school because 16 countries with world-class educators, why not? So ultimately, that can be the value proposition. And I think you guys could do that too. What's that?
That could be a step down for us.
Right, yeah, exactly. Right, so only 16 countries. You're like, is that it? Right, so so what I'm thinking about is how do I get a better value proposition, and then I think you guys can do that too, because you have parents that are saying, oh, we'll do DTS. I mean, I don't really know, why the DTS thing, not as many people going on, but my guess is parents have a lot to do with that, So, but if the parents know that there's pathways that will result in an accredited degree where people have a high rate of getting jobs, then that can become more attractive. So in the same way that I'm going to lose maybe a year of tuition, or lose a part of a year of tuition if I send them to University of the Nations for my pathway, and you guys might say, well, I don't want to lose the senior year, but if we do it together, if we have twice as many students, then we both make more. Does that make sense? So, plugging in other modules based on local needs. So third millennium's in, I think, 6 or 8 languages. They're probably going to be in 15 languages pretty soon. So, that's an easy one to say, could you consider, and I talked with Phil, they'll let you import from Moodle directly their courses, and then you could add them and just make them your course, and make modifications to them. Then, expanding the online only and blended strategy. Part of what online does, like, I don't know what your smallest centers are right now, but by having online, and I know you said you had a few sites that didn't have the capacity to run a SBS themselves, and now they're using the online SBS, but they're going to run it locally. Like, how's that working?
We're excited to find out.
Oh, so it's you're the one doing it. Where is that?
Yeah, in Denver.
Okay.
We don't have the qualified leader, and several opportunities to have one fell through, and so we're exploring the option of doing this sort of hybrid where it's actually just like any other school run on our campus. The group is entirely one school, like a cohort. They're together the whole time. It runs consecutive. It's not broken up at all. It's straight 9-month school in residence, but our leadership is actually the extended studies folks.
Okay.
So it's just because they're providing leadership for us at a distance.
Right.
So it's kind of that.
Yeah, I think there's huge opportunity for that model, because whenever I saw what you're showing, all those centers, and they only had like 2 or 3 of your schools, if you had each of your schools online, then you could have a lot more centers. Then instead of having 2 or 3, they could have all your schools offered.
Yeah.
And they might have the local capacity for only 2 or 3, but then they could have the online capacity for others. So I think that there's huge opportunity for that. The other thing is having a wholesale strategy. In the business world, every marketing strategy, you have two tiers. You have what's called the B2C, business to consumer, and you have the B2B, the business to business. And you guys right now have a strong B2C strategy, but I think that there's in many businesses, the B2B strategy is as big as the B2C. So if, whenever we were talking about how could you guys grow, what if you had 25,000 that came through your channels, and then 25,000 that came through partner channels? I think that might be the type of world that you guys could work with. But for that to work, what you need to do is you need to provide essentially, whenever you go to Sam's Club or wholesale, places, at least in the U.S., I don't know what sort of wholesale places, and you buy, a 50-pound block of cheese, it costs less to get a block of cheese, right? So for partners, like if we could send, it'd probably be a smaller number, but if we're sending 20 students a year to you guys, then can we get a discount so that we're able to make it profitable? And that's the reason why we provide a 50% discount to our partners. One is because we believe in the ministry, but 2 is because if those partners send us students every year, then we don't have to pay for the acquisition cost, and that is like 20% of the cost. So we're only having to discount 30%. Does that make sense? So the same type of thing could work. So questions or thoughts on these other suggestions?
I think the complexity that we are working with is that out of our 650 or so centers, they are actually selling to the students.
Right.
So we are on this level, we do very little on mobilizing the students. We do some, but most of it really happens in those centers. They mobilize, they make a commitment to the students, and they fulfill those commitments.
Right.
So in this strategy, we would need to involve a lot of our friends, where we just met with the group of the 40 largest of them. And I think that would be a dialogue, and finding a way, how does that work from each one of them. And so that is a very different conversation.
So for group buying, what you're saying is the local center would probably have to have buy-in on, is there a discount?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think also you mentioned the transformation process,
Mm-hmm.
and so really discerning what would be the right percentage related to someone's life being truly transformed, both with the community-based training as well as the online training.
Right. Yeah.
So that we continue to achieve
Right.
to do, which is to make disciples to
Right. Yeah. And
inherit the nation.
yeah, and I think part of that would be we would experience it together, right?
Yeah.
So, I heard someone kind of, the idea that transformation could happen online seemed to be a little doubtful. I just interviewed 3 students that they were all heavily addicted to drugs, and they were all, heroin, meth, drug dealers in jail, and they were sober 1 year before they got in our program, and our program absolutely was transformative to them. Because what they did is they went through a year of addiction counseling classes, or in some cases, 2 years. But what they happened in those classes is they're journaling their whole life story. So they went through 2 years of counseling, and they thought they were just learning the knowledge, but they have to journal their whole life story and interpret it through a God lens, and that brings the transformation. So even though the transformation's harder to happen online, there's ways that you can do it. So, right. Well, and part of it is a little online, a little, in person is what I've learned too, because for the people who it's worked best, they're doing it online, but they're also in relationship in a Christian community, so that if they start to relapse and I'm online, it's done, it's over. But if they start to relapse and they have a local Christian community, then they can point them back, and then they get them back in the class. So, and that happens fairly frequently. So, yeah. All right, so one last slide, just to show this graphically, this is kind of what I saw in your data. I just generated this while we were talking earlier. So, you have the University of the Nations, you have DTS, which is the biggest, group of that. I think in a modular partnership strategy, what you could think about is you have University of the Nations, and you have DTS. Some of it's happening, and some of it's happening in other Christian universities. So using DTS, and this is a placeholder for other aspects of University of the Nations, but what I'm saying is I need the transformation. I need the ministry practicum. What if 25% or 50% of your students came through channels like that? And I think that increasingly that's going to be an attractive value proposition. So I think that's about it. The last thing I would say, if you want more of this, I have an online course that's available. There's a mobile app called Udemy. You can look this up, or iTunes U is another mobile app. And then we have a website called the Christian Higher Education Innovation Alliance. That's about 50 Christian leaders who are thinking about this stuff. You could join the email list, and the rest of this course is available on there. The Udemy and iTunes U, that was directed at a secular audience, just teaching all this theory. But on the Christian Higher Education Alliance, I have a couple other presentations that kind of get into more details of Christian implications of this stuff. So, all right. Any other questions that you guys have?
Is there anyone who'd like to take this? Seriously. We need someone to take this.
It's free. So, I mean, what you can do, I take about one of these courses a week because I have to sit in traffic, and I sit on a bridge for like 45 minutes every day, and I'll just sit and listen to one of these courses. So it has the video lectures you just go through. I mean, you're not going to retain as well if you're doing it while you're driving, but it, right? Yeah, exactly. But it's like listening to sermons or something like that. So it's designed for that type of modality. So, and you can look at the slides. You can look at the slides later, because a lot of times I'll say, and look at this on the slide. So don't do that while you're driving. But yeah. So. I think it's at the end. Yeah. It's. Yep. That right there. So yeah.
I'd encourage you at your larger bases to make sure there's someone even at each base taking this.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing I was going to add is, so we're doing this MBA, and my plan is to create an education management track in that. And so for one, what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try to train people to do this. So we'll have a course, and you create an online course in the course, and we'll do something on accreditation, and you actually fill out an accreditation application. So So if you have anyone who wants to do that, you can have them talk with me. But the others, if there's people here, like Brad Trout and others where are you? Oh, there you are, who filled out accreditation applications in Australia, I need help understanding, other countries. So I may want to pick your brain on that, or people who are in the education, College of Education. I'd love to learn from what you guys are doing too. So, all right, thanks.
Thank you, Andrew.